When you look at many of the big problems in the world, you see that there are some people who are working on solutions. That's a big part of the positive side of the story of humanity. We adapt, we work to figure out how to solve some things. But in journalism, you generally wouldn't know that. The way the news world operates, most problems are presented as these two sides disagreeing, and then that's it. News agencies will quote people from each side and say, okay, we've done our job now. Actually, these days, increasingly, it's more like news agencies quote people from only one side. It is not the media's job to create the solutions. But if you're ignoring solutions, then you're skipping a major part of the story. This is such a big problem that there is now actually, pathetically, a term for the rare times that the media actually look for solutions as part of their coverage. This is clear to me in so many stories. One of them became a top story in recent weeks involving the Olympics. You've probably heard about the dispute over gender in boxing, focused on one particular boxer whose gender was questioned. Here's a clip from an AP report.
Algerian boxer Iman Khalif is caught in the middle of a debate over gender regulations in sports. On Thursday, her Italian opponent Angela Carini pulled out just 46 seconds into their boxing match. Carini said she quit because of the pain from getting hit.
Listeners sent me pieces about this issue from opposing sides, and both sides were saying that the media is getting this so wrong because they were looking at media that didn't agree with them. I kept seeing that there was incredibly little talk about what anyone was doing or suggesting to avoid further incidents like this and to try to protect everybody. Today, why any talk of solutions is so often left out of issues in the news. Plus, something related, you may have heard disputes over news reports that use the term pregnant people. There is a whole other way to look at this, at terms we use for all kinds of groups, and that means it can affect all of us. I'll explain that by showing you why I carefully avoided the term African American when I was focusing on a specific set of reports about Black people in this country. And something else today, employees inside one of the world's leading news organizations have called out anti-Semitism, as in behind the scenes in the way that employees are treated. I'm going to share with you the awful response from the head of the agency, not just because of how it can impact their news coverage, but also because of what it says about any employer anywhere. There is a basic rule that should be seen as part of Journalism 101 and Management 101. Plus, the host of a show on cable news gets it right. Exactly what I have been saying, and even calls out his own network. All that coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. I'm Josh Lebs. This is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact-checks the news. I spent 20 years inside mainstream media, 10 on NPR and 10 on CNN, and I became lead fact-checker on air. And throughout all that time, I was seeing these problems in how mainstream media works and shapes the thinking in our society. And I know that it needs to be fixed. This podcast is all about making that happen. With each episode, I send out a newsletter filled with links and facts and more. I don't expect you to take my word for anything. I like sharing all this stuff with you. The newsletter is free. And one way to support this show is to choose to become a paid subscriber. If you do that, then you get access to me directly through the comment section. Also, we now have merch, which is so cool. These bumper stickers at a listener's request and QR stickers. I've been sending them out to supporters of the show. And we have people now in almost all 50 states who have put them on their cars, but we still have a few states to go. If you become a paid subscriber to this show, or you can support in another way, you can give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and a great review. Also, a 5-star rating on Spotify. Let us know that you've done that, and we can get you this merch. When it comes to fact-checking, the hardest ones often to take on can be topics in which emotions are so high that it's hard for some people to even think straight. And that certainly applies to the topic of gender. And it's understandable that there are so many concerns. For example, when it comes to trans people, which is different from what we're going to be discussing, but when it comes to trans people, there are all these studies that show trans people are disproportionately victims of violence. It's also the case that people get attacked for being a woman who is considered too masculine or a man who is considered too feminine, whatever that means to anyone. It's such a sign of people's inability to deal with the infinite diversity of humanity and just sometimes leave each other alone and let people be who they are. But this show is not about that. This show's about the media. When the media looks at any story, it needs to put facts first, always. And the facts include the existence of different ideas about how to handle a problem. That's what we're going to look at today, because it absolutely plays out in this story. I watched and listened to and read through more than 50 different reports, and none of them talked about what the possible solutions are in moving forward. Let's start with just a quick summary. I'm going to be limiting how much I talk about any one individual because this story began with a focus on an Algerian boxer. I don't want to subject her to any more speculation than she has already faced. Here is ABC News.
She's believed to have a variation in her chromosomes. The International Boxing Association disqualified her from a competition last year, saying she failed a gender identity test due to her high levels of testosterone. But the International Olympic Committee says Khalif met all of its eligibility requirements.
I talk often about how truth includes facts plus context. So coverage in general should point out that the International Boxing Association has faced its own criticisms for numerous reasons that involve potential corruption and close ties to the Russian government. The International Olympic Committee does not go by the International Boxing Association. As PBS put it, the committee previously stripped the International Boxing Association's credentials. Meanwhile, here is IOC President Thomas Bach responding to people who say it's unfair to let these boxers take part in these specific competitions.
I can only invite them to come up with a scientific-based, a new definition of who is a woman and how can somebody being born, raised, competed and having a passport as a woman cannot be considered a woman.
Well, some people want to get into chromosomal makeup, which is one of multiple factors that can be a determinant of gender. And there are people who are not XX or XY, and even that can be complicated. USA Today reports that the International Boxing Association said that this particular boxer and one other in the news had XY chromosomes, but we don't know if that's true. An opinion piece in The Telegraph by columnist Janice Turner argued in favor of a type of test that's referred to as a cheek swab.
A sex test was conducted only once in a female athlete's career. A quick cheek swab with a cotton bud revealing biological sex was added to her permanent record. Anti-doping tests are far more intrusive and can happen anytime.
But it's not that simple either. The medical encyclopedia from the National Institutes of Health says that this smear test can confirm whether a patient is male or female. But there's also lots of reporting about why this type of test is inconclusive. All right, so here's what the news should explain to you. First, general discussions should never be used to attack individual athletes who were allowed to compete there under the rules and who can face real dangers from hateful people. That should always be made clear. Next, it's a fact that the Olympics, like most sports, divvy up by gender, and that there will be some times when that is not clear-cut. So, you need rules. And there is, of course, opportunity for a rational discussion about what the rules should or should not be. But we are not hearing that in this coverage. Here's an example from CNN. Host Laura Coates was talking about this boxer, and she also brought up a runner, Caster Semenya, who wrote a piece in the New York Times about her experience.
If you've just read her guest essay in the New York Times last year, it is unbelievably compelling, and it's reignited a lot of debate about fairness in women's sports. And you have to wonder, why is it such a polarizing issue? Why is it so hard to believe that someone could be an exceptional athlete and a woman?
The idea that women are challenged on whether they can really be exceptional athletes, that's a legitimate point. But that is not a legitimate way to summarize what's going on here, because that ignores the reality that there are complexities around gender. Subjectively, by the way, I agree. Caster Semenya's column, adapted from her book, is compelling as a story of her experience. I'll include a link to it in the newsletter. Here's something she says in it. Quote, "At age 18, I had my first gynecological exam. Afterward, I learned that I had XY chromosomes rather than the typically female XX pairing and high levels of testosterone produced by undescended testicles I didn't know I had. And then she goes into how it affected her, but that she absolutely recognizes herself to be a woman and has always competed as a woman and could not compete with the greatest male athletes. When the Olympics do divvy up by gender, they have to consider all these complicated issues. USA Today explains that the International Olympic Committee currently leaves it up to international federations that govern each sport. So different sports can decide differently. And then, of course, those rules can obviously be subjected to pressure from different sides. Another key point, people have all kinds of bodily differences, and some of those differences are celebrated as being wonderful. Here's a trans athlete speaking on the BBC.
We didn't discriminate against Michael Phelps because of his extremely large wingspan and his ability to process lactic acid. That was an advantage that made him the greatest swimmer in the world.
And runner Usain Bolt has a physical advantage as well. Here's BBC Radio.
He also has a high percentage of what we call fast twitch muscles. And those fast twitch fibers really contract very, very rapidly, and they produce very powerful forces. And you need to have lots of fast twitch fiber.
If someone lives their life as a certain gender and meets certain standards for that gender, do they just happen to have one of these rare physical advantages for a certain sport? Or do other factors have to be considered for how they are placed into a sport that is separated by gender? This stuff is complicated. There's an interesting interview I found, and I'm going to share a couple little clips from it with you, but I need to contextualize them carefully. This is a woman with an organization for women in sports. It comes from several years ago on the BBC, and she was not talking about any specific individuals. She was actually talking about trans athletes, which is different from people who may have what's called DSD, difference in sex development. But something she points out applies to this whole issue. It involves testosterone. It's an important point. Oh, and as you hear her speaking, she's speaking in a gym, so there's some background sound.
A girl, if she developed and trained on testosterone, she would be called a cheat. It would be doping, and she would be banned from competition. Yet we also now have these rules where a male-bodied person can naturally develop and train on the testosterone, and it will not be called cheating because the rules allow it, and that's not fair. We need to find creative solutions for letting them compete, but that must not involve opening up the female category to male-bodied people.
So, in a case that's not about someone trans, but is, say, a case involving someone with DSD, if they are also able to train and develop on higher levels of testosterone, even if they then have to drop testosterone levels in order to compete, if they have trained and developed on those higher levels, is that just a performance advantage, or does it get in the way of gender separation in sports? Anyway, I like how she said we need solutions. I have not seen any reporting that asks that question or speaks to what can be worked out here. Like, should there be a standard set of rules across all sports for this issue? Should there be more extensive sets of tests that do not humiliate or invade anyone, but that do use science to get the most possible clarity, everything involving gender? Or do there need to be competitions for people that aren't divided in a gender binary system? Keep in mind, we already divvy up some sports in ways other than by gender. Like, here's a little clip from a CBS story.
Grigsby is both Miss Junior Teen United States and the Alabama girls wrestling champion in her weight class.
I'm full of surprises, I guess. Definitely more aggressive and stronger than I appear on the outside.
That's, of course, a great story to tell, but also notice the words weight class in there. There are weight classes in wrestling and in boxing to try to create fairer competitions. In fact, listen to this report from CNN.
Heaven Fitch is the first female to ever win a North Carolina high school individual state championship in wrestling, and she did it by beating all the boys last weekend in the 106-pound weight class.
Wrestled my best, and I kind of dominated the match, if I'm being honest.
She's wrestling boys in her weight class. I'm not saying that's the solution. I'm saying we're talking about sports, not nuclear disarmament. This should be a case in which media can help bring cooler heads together and ask them, as part of the coverage, what specific steps are you recommending? What would work? What would not work? This is part of the story. And the lack of this way of thinking is a problem in news in general. In newsrooms, often it doesn't even occur to people to look at solutions. It's just, here's one side, here's the other. I remember once at CNN, I wanted to do a segment about this group that had some new and interesting ideas about ways to get rid of the national deficit and pay down the debt. An executive said no. She said doing a topic like that was, in her words, too heady. How's that for disrespecting your audience? Anyway, I discovered in preparing for all this that now there is a group pushing what it calls solutions journalism. A woman I used to work with, the former CNN anchor, Relitza Vasilova, now at the University of Georgia. She is part of a group called Solutions Journalism Network. She spoke about this topic recently in a video.
If we don't look for solutions, then we really aren't giving people an objective idea of their world. It's a world in which everything is going wrong and nothing is being done about it. So we have to restore that balance.
Out of curiosity, I looked to see whether any broadcast news agencies were using that term, solutions journalism, and I kid you not, this is what popped up. You might be like, no way, that's a big topic Josh has talked about. This was Ari Melber on MSNBC in 2021.
And as America follows this road under President Biden to wider vaccination, well, these are probably just some of the examples, models, and debates in store for us ahead. In that spirit, as we do some solutions journalism, I'm thrilled to tell you that we have a special guest live from Tel Aviv, Israel.
He then brought in a Wall Street Journal reporter who talked about how Israel was leading the way in showing how to get things moving again. But there shouldn't have to be a separate term, solutions journalism. It's just journalism. All right, coming up, a whole different way to look at the pregnant people controversy and why it's important to think through what we call any group of people, including groups that you might be a part of, after this. Thank you to MIT45 for its support. The company is committed to bringing Kratom to consumers in the right ways. The folks at MIT45 want people to use Kratom safely, legally, and in the ways that are most effective and helpful as part of a healthcare routine in consultation with their healthcare providers. Listen to my interview with CEO Ryan Niddell in episode 14. He explained the mission that he's on to try to help people, including in the media, get educated about this. In recent years, a lot of news organizations have shifted how they sometimes discuss pregnancy. Here's PBS.
If there's an emergency, pregnant people can find themselves caught between accepted medical standards and the religious-based policies of Catholic-run facilities.
And some people have been up in arms about that, like what you'd expect from Fox.
From now on, we're using the term pregnant people to recommend women get the vaccine. Take that, feminists. Even people who think the earth is flat are saying that's a bad idea.
Some women say the term pregnant people erases women. Here's something I realized. There is a very different way to look at this, and a terminology for groups in general. It's something that the news business should pay more attention to. Years ago, I was assigned to do a report on air about the most common causes of death in America. These were figures from the CDC, and they broke down the figures by race. And I pointed out that I was specifically avoiding the term African American and was instead saying Black. As a rule, we would use those terms interchangeably. But, as you know from listening to this show, I'm into accuracy. Facts first, always. This data set could include people who are Black but not African American. These figures included people who died in America. They might have just been here without being American citizens. They also might not have African backgrounds. This could be someone who was Aboriginal from Australia. And yes, when I spent time in the Aboriginal community in Australia, when I was doing some news coverage there, people told me they prefer the term Aboriginal, not Aborigine. The chances are, in these CDC statistics, 99% of the people were probably African American, maybe 99.9%. I don't know. So for pure accuracy, I was saying Black Americans. You might think, okay, but it's not the same with gender. Well, here's what we need to look at. Even if you set aside trans identities and a society's growing understanding of what it is for a person to be trans, Even if you look at most traditional definitions of gender, there are people who do not fit those traditional definitions of woman who can get pregnant. There are people with XY chromosomes, for example, who can menstruate and get pregnant. These things can happen. So, in terms of pure data, just based on fact, it can be more inclusive and accurate to say pregnant people. And then you add in the issue of being trans or non-binary and the complexities around that and what gender is. And you can find that the more inclusive, accurate term is pregnant people. There's also another issue, which is that females under age 18 are not yet women, and they can be pregnant too. So pregnant girls should be in there as well. Yet another reason that people can work. Now, let's make this clear. There is nothing wrong with saying pregnant women. In fact, in the news business, the AP style book is like the style Bible. And they specifically say, use either one. It can depend on what you're talking about. But when people hear pregnant people, they have often an emotional reaction. And another way to see it is as the term that includes everyone in the data set. And this is significant for anyone who is in any group of people. You might be considered part of a category, a political category, a religious category, something about your race. That term might be used for you, and you might not know whether it applies to you. There are different takes on all these things. For example, when Sonia Sotomayor became a justice on the Supreme Court, she was being called the first Hispanic justice. And I was at CNN at the time, and we got some messages from people who said she's the second because there was this guy, Benjamin Cardozo, who was on the Supreme Court. His background was Portuguese, and the term Hispanic came from Hispaniola, which did include Portugal. But then there were people who said that because his family was Jewish, they would not have been thought of as being part of this same group. The point is, there are times when you may be factored into a group, but you might think internally, well, I'm not sure I'm quite inside that group. Oh, and for the record, the word woman does not come from womb. The etymology involves this other thing, wyf, W-Y-F in Old English, and apparently no one's definite what that meant. Finally today, a group of more than 200 people involved with a major news agency come together to inform management that the organization has a major problem with anti-Semitism. And what does the chief executive say? Oy, I'll tell you after this.
Hello, Josh. It's Gabe Meister from New York, although I'm recording this message from Tokyo. I'm listening to your latest episode, and I just wanted to thank you for They Stand Corrected. It's just fantastic. I'm an attorney, so I work with words all day, every day, and it's kind of baffling to me to watch the media race to judgment on really crucial events with few or no facts at hand, or worse, with really low-quality information from untrustworthy sources. It's sort of like shout first and ask questions later. We all need to do better in consuming media, so thank you for these tools and for your incredible work here.
In the first episodes of this show, which was just a few months ago, I looked at the most pressing problem with mainstream media, and that is the set of lies that these news organizations push about Israel. We saw in the coverage of the October 7th massacres and ever since how these problems fuel real-life dangers and hatred, and how anti-Semitism is on the rise with the help of the media. Well, among the places blowing it and pushing anti-Semitic takes regularly is the BBC. If you haven't heard, I encourage you to go back and listen. It is not shocking that recently, more than 200 staff, contractors, suppliers, and contributors of the BBC wrote to its board and its chairman, Samir Shah, demanding an investigation into anti-Jewish racism there. According to a bunch of reports about this, principally in the Telegraph, this letter lays out details of what these folks have been experiencing and how difficult it is. I want you to hear how the chairman responded, because it's this word salad non-response. The Jerusalem Post reported that he wrote back to these folks saying that it's of great concern that some people feel that way. But then he went right into praising the BBC's allegedly inclusive culture in which people of all backgrounds feel supported, even though that's obviously not true. And then he wrote this.
I am satisfied, however, that where we have made errors, the executive have acted appropriately and handled matters in accordance to the guidance as they apply to my colleagues, Shah said.
So, these folks wrote him about specific problems, and he responded that he's confident that executives have acted appropriately? How could he know that? And according to these reports, he wrote back that he has asked the executive to see if this letter includes anything that has not been previously considered. But he dismissed the calls for an investigation. Here's another clip from the Jerusalem Post.
Film producer Leo Perlman, who also signed the letter, said, "No other minority has been or will be treated with this level of disdain." The response, "Nothing to see here, not even worthy of an investigation. Gaslighting by every definition."
Yup, that's when the term gaslighting actually applies. Management 101 and Journalism 101 should both include this basic rule: always ask first. Presuming that you know things is the opposite of good journalism and the opposite of good management. The last thing anyone with that mentality should be doing is managing a news agency where those two 101s come together. Would that make them a 202? No, forget it. Anyway, this is just the latest problem with the BBC. They told staff not to take part in a march against anti-Semitism, but they had also told staff that it was okay to take part in a pride parade. So, it's okay to publicly celebrate part of your identity, depending on what that is, but not to celebrate pride in being Jewish amid rising anti-Semitism. And after a public uproar, the BBC fired a scheduler, which is a pretty high-ranking position, after reports exposed the fact that she was doing all these anti-Semitic posts on social media. Here's a competitor network in the UK, GBN, talking about her.
She calls Nazi, apartheid, parasites, the Jewish people. They funded a hollow hoax. I mean, this is just racism 101. It's so extreme. It's insane.
Is. It really is.
I've pointed out previously that executives genuinely don't care about anti-Semitism in most cases. And one of the biggest reasons is that they believe this extremely common myth that Jews cry wolf. They believe that Jews routinely call things anti-Semitic that aren't. They believe Jews call all criticism of Israel anti-Semitic. That's a myth you've probably heard. It's disproven by facts, it's disproven by data, but people believe it anyway. And that helps them turn a blind eye to any and all anti-Semitism. So, what can you do about this? And what can you do about the things I discussed earlier in this show? Well, as you know, I am all about solutions. In my newsletter, I offer text that you can send to news executives, calling them out. And I offer more than that as well. I offer links to social media posts that you can amplify. It just takes a few seconds to click to share them. Check out all of it. You can find everything you need through my website, joshlebs.com, and it's linked in the show notes wherever you're listening now. Before we go, I mentioned something at the top today, that the host of a cable news show got something exactly right. Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC called out the news networks, including his own, for carrying Trump's dumpster fire of a so-called news conference live.
Donald Trump spoke at his home in Florida for over an hour, and all of the cable news networks, including this one, carried it live, just like they all did repeatedly in 2016. It would be hard to find a sentence in what Donald Trump said today that did not include at least one lie. Some of the networks tried to play catch-up with fact-checking after Donald Trump finished speaking, but that, of course, is way too late and utterly useless. No network even attempted to fact-check every lie Donald Trump told.
Yes, this. As you know, if you've been listening to this show, I can't stand how the news has become this giant open mic night in which people are allowed to say whatever. That's also why I explained the debates are disasters. They're not journalism. It's so good to have someone on the inside saying it. I don't know Lawrence personally, but I sent a note to someone else I know at MSNBC, then hopefully he'll hear it. If you're listening and you know him, hey, tell him about this. I'm sharing this with you now at the end of this episode because in the next episode, I'm going to talk you through other ways that the news acts as an open mic night and lets people lie all the time. It's not just by carrying things live. There are these other ways that we're so used to, we don't even notice. There's a line similar to the oath that doctors take that all journalists should keep in mind as the fundamental determinant in daily work. I'll explain that, so be here for the next episode. In the meantime, let me know what you think about all of this. We're getting so many responses to last week's episode about CNN's bonkers lie about militaries and the IDF. Amazing reactions, so thank you. I'm going to share some of your reactions to that and to the topics in this episode and your thoughts on political lies, your thoughts on all this stuff in upcoming episodes. So here's how you can get me your thoughts. Paid subscribers to the newsletter, you have access to a comments section, and that is the first place I go to get your messages so you can reach me directly through there. Everyone else can find a form at my website. In both cases, what I've done is design a system in which you can send me your thoughts without having to worry that random haters and spammers are going to jump on you for it. It's a safe space that I have carved out for you to be able to get me your thoughts, your questions, things you want me to fact check, all that good stuff. All right, thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week.